The events of World War II cast a shadow over the rest of the century, and perhaps over the rest of history, and inevitably they changed the course of Western art. In Europe, the unbelievable scale of the Nazi genocide against the Jews left Europeans with the task not only of restoring their broken cities, but of repairing their shattered culture. And in America, the explosion of the first atom bomb out here in the deserts of the Southwest meant that for the first time, the fears of medieval man might come true, that the entire world might be destroyed in a single terrifying apocalypse. It was against this background that the post-war artists created their art. While Europeans couldn't forget their past, in America, artists turned their backs on what they saw as the public and political dimension of art. The abstract expressionists, centered in New York, escaped to an interior world where the subjective landscape and the struggle with brushwork and pigment became the goal of painting. For the first time, Europe looked to New York.
Abstract expressionism, abstract art, is part of Western tradition. It evolves out of it, it's part of it, remains part of it. It's not Oriental, it's not a new tradition.
Clement Greenberg, critic and promoter of the New York School, became their spokesman and a friend of the leading abstract expressionist, Jackson Pollock.
I first met Jackson Pollock in 1942. Came down the sidewalk and there was Lee Krasner, whom I'd known of old, and she was with a very respectable looking gentleman. And I saw this rather nice looking guy, and Lee said to me, "This fellow's going to be a great painter." I said, "Well, okay." What finally hit me in Pollock's art was the portable mural he did for the apartment house in which Peggy Guggenheim lived. That hit me. It was the first time I saw him go all over, repeat this way. I thought that was a great painting, and I began to follow Pollock assiduously, you can say, after that.
Raised in the American Southwest, Pollock was influenced by Indian sand painting, and in a sense, his works internalized the desert landscape itself. In New York, he studied the works of modern European masters, especially Miro and Picasso.
I think he had his best run in 47, 48, 49, 50. The all-over, what I call the all-over, when he spattered or dripped or whatever. About his art, Pollock knew what he was about. He trusted his spontaneity, let's say what they call automatic painting. But he was in control. He'd stop from time to time to see what he'd done. And then when a picture was finished, he'd go back and edit now and then. When it comes to abstract art, there's no subject matter, but there is content. And the two have to be distinguished, subject matter and content.
In other words, the presence or absence of a recognizable image has nothing to do with value in art. It doesn't have to be about anything.
I gave it the title, Lavender Mist. Well, I saw it, and I flipped for it, and then I thought, well, his predominant color was lavender, that kind of violet. And it was sort of a little misty, and so I suggested that to Jackson. He said, sure. He wasn't this wild, heedless genius. No, he wasn't that. He looked hard, and he was very sophisticated about painting.
The gesture of Pollock creates an arena for a personal drama. It is not a document of an historical and social tragedy. Instead, in Europe, the artist couldn't forget the trauma of the war, and each painting, each sculpture is full of scars, is full of pain, is full of blood. It carries on the memory of death.
The painting, It's How You Feel, by the French artist Vauthier, suggests the look of broken flesh, its blemishes and craters. The Italian artist Fontana literally attacked the clay, ripping its surface open. He used scissors to stab these holes into the canvas. European abstract expressionism was more controlled, more finished. The American art had a different look.
I'd say that we had looser surfaces, let's call it that. You felt a freshness and a kind of emphasis. I don't want to say violence. That word's been misused in this connection.
Franz Klein drew inspiration from Cubism. Willem de Kooning did portraits that became highly charged responses to the women who were his models.
The abstract expressionists wanted to paint on the same level of quality as the old masters, or as, let's say, the best of the school of Paris, Picasso, Matisse, Mondrian. They were striving for excellence, and they found that they did better work when they went abstract.
Mark Rothko chose a path to pure expression by using only gradations of color on his canvases. Pollock's vision and Greenberg's theory were explored by a second generation. Many acknowledged that Helen Frankenthaler adapted Pollock's technique in a way that made him more accessible to other artists. She stained her canvas with highly diluted paint to achieve these haunting effects in mountains and sea. The abstract expressionist movement dominated the world of Western art for over a decade. By the mid-50s, they were established, only to be superseded by a new avant-garde.
The post-war world is characterized by an acceleration of speed. Speed of travel, of information, of communication, indeed, speed of change itself. And a style which in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance took decades to work itself out could now run its course in a year or even less. And in such a culture, saturated with objects, with advertising, packaging and TV, it was inevitable that art itself should not merely reflect this, but in a sense become the object. For if the content mattered so little in comparison with the packaging, then why not use a Coke bottle or a soup tin? The young generation then taught that not only was art unheroic, it was anywhere and could be anything.
Robert Rauschenberg's use of Coke bottles, a spare tire, a goat, shocked his audience. "If this is art," said one abstract expressionist, "I quit."
What's very curious in the history of art is that often the moments where something really decisive happens to change that history, those moments are not terribly perceptible to their contemporaries and only become perceptible in retrospect. I think that one of these moments occurred, at least for our modern sensibilities, with the work of Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. This is a Rauschenberg called Trophy 3. What Rauschenberg does is to insist that the surface of the canvas is no longer a window into which we look or through which we look, a window that opens onto another world, as, say, this little porthole that I'm looking through that opens onto the skyline of New York. I can see the Empire State Building through it. Rather, what we have is the surface of the canvas as a horizontal field, like a desktop, like the working surface of somebody's studio or somebody's writing table, onto which junk is piled. Mail, postcards, posters, advertisements, records, magazines, newspapers, a kind of tremendous clutter of banal experience that interpolates even great art into that clutter, as here in Rauschenberg's Small Rebus. Rauschenberg went on to build a wall of information by silkscreening photographic images onto canvas, as in this work called Port Arthur, Texas. The result is that everything here is homogenized in the uniform surface of photographic information. We may think of photography as a realistic medium, but Rauschenberg shows it as a single, flattened informational field, as flat as the screens of our television sets or the front pages of our newspapers. One of the things that happens in Jasper Johns' work is that he makes the image that's projected inside the canvas synonymous with the surface of the canvas. There is no more interior space in the image. The target, the American flag, are manifestly, absolutely on the surface of the canvas. Johns is being ironic about earlier pictorial subjects like portraits or still lives or landscapes. This painting, based on Buckminster Fuller's map of the world, is an ironic landscape, flattened to match the modern tourist's impression of space. By refusing illusion, Johns was making some sort of comment about the nature of modern experience.
In the mid-1950s, the art of the disposable consumer culture was born. In '57, the British artist Richard Hamilton issued its manifesto. This art, he said, should be popular, that is designed for a mass audience. It should be transient, expendable, low cost, mass-produced, gimmicky. And in the 1960s, this art came of age, pop.
There was at that moment a kind of liberating nihilism, a sense that you could sort of clear away the junk of an inheritance from the 19th century, which people had long since ceased to believe in. So that kind of clearing away and allowing oneself to really stare modern culture in the face, that had a tremendously liberating, invigorating, energizing quality. And it's that quality that gave pop art its kind of joyousness at the beginning. even though a lot of the message had this very acid undertone because it was denying a lot of things that we like to think about ourselves. When Roy Lichtenstein turns to the visual vocabulary of comic books, he is examining stereotypes, packaged images, packaged plots, packaged personalities. Warhol's move is absolutely brilliant because what he does is to make a canvas which is nothing but the repetition of identical objects that are the product of mass production, assembly line production. Warhol focuses on the effect of the commodity. Its existence is pure repetition. And his commodities extend to people as well, especially movie stars. Our experience of singular, unique events becomes flattened out through the repetition of the way we experience such an event when it comes to us through either newspaper, magazine, or television. One of these unique events that Warhol presented as banalized through newspaper reportage would be the riots in Selma, Alabama. We don't have an individuality that's secreted away from that clamor and refuse and chaos of the everyday. We are that chaos.
While in America with pop art, the attention was given to recording and to criticizing the consumer culture carried on by object, comic strips, advertising, and the media. In Europe, Yves Klein and Joseph Beuys was dealing with the idea of the artist as a shaman, the person that can change the sensibility of the world. A pilot in the German Luftwaffe, Joseph Beuys was shot down during World War II. This brush with death permeates his works. Here a man appears to be in the jaws of a reptile entrapped in a pipe. It is like an ancient totem on its side, suggesting death and birth at the same time. For Beuys, each element in the world has the same value. For him, there is no difference between animals, plants, objects, or human beings. All share the same energy. He envisioned a world where everyone was an artist. His work dramatizes unrealized potential, like the sound of flowers decaying or the symbolic power of the cross. This piano is wrapped in felt, like an elephant's hide, but the concert ground is not dead, only mute. Underneath, it can still be played. Yves Klein had the desire to purify reality, painting everything blue. This kind of blue has been invented by Klein to represent and to symbolize the spirituality and the material sensibility that permeates any substance. In a carefully orchestrated event in the early 60s, Klein took these models and made them his paint brushes. traces of their bodies remain. The canvas is transformed into a blue icon that represents the transformation of the flesh into purity.
Minimal art, or what came to be known as minimalism, was really a phenomenon of abstract sculpture that ran parallel to the rise of pop art in the early 60s. Minimal art seems to have devised a kind of abstract sculptural analog to what it was that pop art was doing. Like pop art, one felt that the artist was taking a certain kind of almost perverse and nihilistic pleasure in sweeping away this sense of the artist-creator as the generator of form, and instead subjecting himself or herself to the idea of these abstract forms as something that he, of course, could not have invented.
What they did was to place the object into the gallery space or into the open air, so it was affected by changes in the environment around it, changes in light, in color, and in perspective.
We've been looking at a late work by Sol LeWitt, where a white pyramid and a black slab bracket a Baroque palace in Munster, Germany. When we remind ourselves that sculpture, because it is three-dimensional and freestanding, is the model of the human body, of ourselves, we understand that these sculptors are using this strategy to say something about us, its observers. The relationship of the work to its specific site becomes an abstract way of insisting that the individual is determined by his or her political and cultural context.
In 1968, a wave of opposition to the establishment swept through the West like a seismic upheaval. The shock waves were felt even behind the Iron Curtain in the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia.
Here in New York at Columbia University, the storming of the gates during a violent demonstration against the Vietnam War
became a symbol of a generation's protest in a year fraught with assassination and rioting.
And in France, the government all but fell to an alliance of students and workers. The year ended with the establishment back in power, but this dissident youth culture had become international and politicized. And one result was the rejection of all forms of establishment art. And the effects of that are still with us.
The heroic symbols of World War II are ironically recycled by Edward Kienholz in the Portable War Memorial. Images of glory from the last just war reverberate bitterly at the end of the 60s.
This is Maya Yinling's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., where the names of all the Americans who died in that war are inscribed.
Initially, her design invoked storms of protest because it was considered unheroic. Both pop and minimalism ultimately evoke similar feelings of ambivalence and loss. This is Storm King Art Park in upstate New York. By the 70s, massive abstract works like these had become the blue-chip staple of corporate collectors in America. "50 years ago, the German critic Walter Benjamin prophesied that the impact of film and mass reproduction would be to change forever our idea of what art is. And now, as we come towards the end of the century, we're nearer that point than ever before. Since the 60s in particular, many people have felt that Western art is in a state of crisis and confusion, with no pattern or direction. Indeed, that the Western tradition is played out. Abstraction lost its shock value and became ordinary. The new directions suggested by pop and minimalism seem to many to be a dissolution of all tradition. At the heart of all this, perhaps, lies the belief that the myth of progress, which has sustained the West for so long, is now at an end. There is a feeling of contradiction between our material demands and our spiritual needs. Because of this, many artists today are turning back to first principles. And of course, the first principle of all is nature. This is Robert Smithson in a film he made in 1970 of his pivotal earthwork, Spiral Jetty. This 1,500-foot-long coil of rock was built in Utah's Great Salt Lake. It leads the visitor out into the water like an ancient hero venturing through a maze. He sought a modern restatement of the artist's relationship to nature, one which led away from what he considered to be the historical exhaustion of painting and sculpture. Spiral Jetty is now underwater, but the concept of earthworks like this challenged, expanded, and revitalized our notion of what art is. In the environmental work, Running Fence, 6 miles of parachute material mounted on poles was stretched across Sonoma, California, to the sea. The entire ranching community and the California Office of Environmental Protection were involved in deciding whether the fence would be allowed, and so, indirectly, whether this was a work of art at all. The controversy was part of the experience. At the same time, attempts were being made in urban environments to respond to criticisms that our culture had become dehumanized. New ways were sought for art to reach the people.
In the early 70s, the idea of the museum changed. When the Pompidou Center in Paris was planned, it was envisioned as a kind of anti-museum. It was to become a factory of information, a sort of center for news, a center for the masses, a kind of supermarket for culture. The The idea was that the square and all the area around the building was more important in a certain way than the space inside. They thought that the museum has to go in the street and not the people from the street has to go in the museum. So it was reversing the attitude of visitors. The original plan called for huge video screens projecting news of the world into the square. This whimsical fountain by Jean Tinguely and Niki de Sanfel add to the creative surrounding. All over the world in the 70s, artists felt a desire to get out of the enclosed space of the museum and try to invade the city. So they start to think big, and they start to think in a large-scale way that create objects that compete with skyscrapers and with large elements, but also they want to compete with the media and create something that is so theatrical that take the attention of the media and compare the media with art. The Swiss Army knife was designed as a ship for the city of Venice. It was the main character of a performance piece created by Claes Oldenburg, Koje van Bruggen, and Franco Gehry. Like any art object, it has different levels of meaning. It represents tourism. In fact, the army knife is always in the pocket of the traveler, but also it is the symbol of the double reality of Venice, the schizophrenia of Venice, which is seen in the contrast between the past and the present, an invasion of modern materials into a very ancient city. The knife is truly a ship. It traveled through the water of the canals of Venice. So it becomes the symbol of a city and represent also the people visiting the city. It's a traveling object. And so, as a traveling object, it becomes a nomad. So a work of art is a nomad, going everywhere in city as New York, Paris, Venice, and Los Angeles.
Oldenburg's witty play with scale has been copied everywhere, as here in Soho, New York's fashionable art center of the 80s.
We've now reached the point where more people are exposed to art than ever before in history, not only through books, films, museums, but from the everyday artifacts around them in their lives, through advertising, through packaging, through the very clothes that they wear. The distinction between art and commodity is now blurred. So where does the artist go from here?
We're looking at the skyline of New York, this sort of mythic image of modernist progress, of endless sense of possibilities opening in front of an early 20th century, sort of drunk on its own sense of growth and power. And what's interesting is that now, for us in the age of postmodernism, this skyline, this sort of mythic field of vision seems to have receded from our view, or seems to have sort of vanished into a reproduction of itself. Richard Haas here has painted the blank wall of a Soho building, precisely to trick us.
Postmodernism is a term that architects adopted in the early 70s to describe a kind of building that dropped a veil of neoclassical decoration in front of a traditional box-like structure.
This is Michael Graves's Portland building in Oregon, more interested in the building as an image than as a three-dimensional experience. What we're really dealing with in the period in which we live is an extraordinary conformity that, despite the seeming pluralism, the seeming diversity, in fact, we are seeing many, many different reflections of the same underlying reality. And it is that underlying reality which seems to me to be at the root of what's happening in the art of our time. It's as though the world has become a kind of huge billboard or an opaque wall of images that separates us as individuals from a nature that might exist behind that wall, but which we cannot penetrate to. Somehow, reality has been swallowed up by a television tube. So this sort of nightmare possibility accounts for absolutely everything that's going on now. Certain artists have dedicated their work to the problem of how to break through this wall, how to put a kind of little crowbar underneath it and try to get some sort of leverage on it, try to make a kind of space between the imitation of the real and the real, or to try to comment on the ways in which we are trapped in this, what we could call Plato's cave, in which what we are looking at is a world of shadows, a world of simulations, rather than a world of real things.
Tony Berlant confines a miniature 19th century landscape within the modern contours of hammered metal. Gilbert and George appear in their own paintings, a pair of artists romping through an unreal media world.
Postmodern is a new way of saying modernism. This kind of new culture that represents absence of distinction between originality and reproduction. And the idea that you go to the past and quote the past, remake the past in order to say something new.
In fact, for today's artists, the problem seems to be, what new is there to say? In a vanitas of style, Pat Steer takes the traditional still life genre and fragments her painting into 64 separate frames. The range of styles presents an encapsulated course in the history of Western art.
Boldly invoking the classical tradition, Carlo Maria Mariani has painted looking into a celestial mirror. The artist self-consciously winks at his postmodern audience, a public fully aware of the ironies of recycling the heroic past in an unheroic age. Here Giulio Paolini presents art looking at art. Two replicas of the most famous of Greek sculptures, the Venus de Milo, mirror each other. Beauty studies beauty in order to develop.
The Palais Royal in Paris is an 18th century building that houses part of the French administration. Daniel Buren was asked to make a sculpture for its courtyard that would complete this glorious architectural monument. What he chose to do was to complete it as a ruin, turning the idea of the colonnaded peristyle into the stunted columns from an antique acropolis felled by time.
Before this work was installed, De Plateau was blocked by a court injunction. Buren's work became the subject of a memorable cultural battle, as only the French can wage. The conservative newspaper of Paris roared its disapproval, calling the work cultural hooliganism. Ultimately, people were attracted to the new landmark as a congenial place to be.
A moving example of postmodern architecture is this museum in Mönchengladbach, Germany, specifically designed by Ansel Line to house avant-garde art. References to the Greek citadel, to the skyscraper, and to the cathedral are all successfully combined here. What has been built in the 80s with the Mönchengladbach Museum is more the museum as a temple, as a church, substituting the museum as a place for another god. And art is the new religion of today, where you go, you don't understand, but you trust. That's what the religion is about. You have to trust because it's in the museum.
Anselm Kiefer's massive winged book captures both the spiritual and the material, the debasement of the word in our time and a persistent belief in it. The wings rise towards the heavens, while the material, lead, insists upon its place on earth. In Departure from Egypt, Kiefer varies the surface texture, including straw and a metal pipe which suggests the rod of Moses, again to re-examine the symbols of belief that have endured in our culture. But in the 20th century, the forces of irrationality and violence have also endured. Order, a mysterious piece by Robert Morris, suggests an altar with painted flames suspended in its center, and a sculpture of the fire's smoke curling out into the air. Skulls are embedded in the mantle, images of death and sacrifice. Sigmar Polke uses an overlay of styles and techniques in The Death of Paganini. His imagery frequently alludes to death and rebirth. Computer discs, skulls and swastikas swirl over the dying genius. In this art, we seem to see the legacy of the West contaminated. This is The Bride by Niki de Saint-Phal. If, as so many of these contemporary artists seem to be saying, ours is a culture out of balance, then women artists are becoming increasingly important in offering us an alternative.
Western art has been grounded on the figure of the woman standing for beauty, for nature, for truth, for eros. In short, the woman is a series of cultural abstractions pronounced through the medium of her mute body. Feminist artists want to break through this condition of being mute, of the woman always having someone else speak for her. Sometimes this is done by parodying the roles women have played in traditional art. We see this in the work of Alexis Smith. Or again, in the work of Cindy Sherman. Or by giving the woman's voice back to her, as in the work of Barbara Kruger, or Jenny Holzer.
This tower in Münster, Germany, was used as a prison for torture in medieval times and again during World War II. For the European artists, it is very important the dialogue between past and present, history and our time. Rebecca Horn is using an abandoned building, not for romantic reason, but because it is a building that has a memory of the torture and includes in the space the sound of torture, water dripping, hammers striking, so that the silence of history is broken. Human beings once cried out in this cell. This tower has a kind of strange life, because it is full of these phantoms. Torture in the Middle Ages and again during World War II by Nazis. This building has this kind of strange life because it's full of these phantoms. The installation is temporary, to last for just 6 months. So there is a dialectical condition of the piece that relates the history of Germany to Germany today.
Our works of art appear to have become ruins. Only our perception is real, and our senses are bombarded with the images and sounds of media which inform us but do not transform us. In a society saturated with data, the function of the artist is no longer to depict events, but rather to reawaken our perception. This is the Rodin crater in the painted desert of Arizona. Here, artist James Turrell has turned back to the earth for his inspiration.
For the modern viewer to experience this work of art will be something of an act of pilgrimage. When you come in, you won't come over the top of the crater, you'll come through a 1,400-foot long tunnel, which will be lined with the blue clay sand that the local Navajo Indians use for their art. And the tunnel will be so built to line up with the sun at every equinox and with the moon every 18 years. And the other viewing platforms in the crater will also be lined up with the planets, like the monuments of the ancient world, designed to take you out of yourself. Out here, above the immensity of the painted desert, with volcanic cones stretching away to the horizon, is the very image of geological rather than human time. And yet what Turrell is trying to do up here is literally reshape nature with human hands. He's transforming this crater into a perfect circle, so that the modern visitor may come here and in this silence and solitude take in the clear sky of the North Arizona desert like a complete sphere. And in doing that, he's trying to restore to us some of that sense of magic, the power and the presence which the ancient monuments on earth possessed. The monuments of the Egyptians and the Maya, the ancient Greeks, the great stone circles and earthworks of Britain, like Stonehenge, all of them places which mediated between human beings, nature, the stars, and the cosmos, in the belief held by all so-called primitive peoples that human beings and the whole of creation were one. And like them, this is ultimately an architecture of space and light, the mystery at the heart of all art.
At the beginning of this series, we tried to define the Western tradition in terms of the culture which arose among the peoples of Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, the core of whose ethics came from Judeo-Christian religion and whose artistic inheritance owed so much to the Greeks and the Romans. And in fact, much of what follows in the story of Western art can be seen as variations on the love-hate relationship that Western artists had with Greek and Roman classicism. But that is just one view. Every generation takes from the past what it needs to make sense of itself. There is no such thing as objective history, in art as in anything else. There are only our interpretations, our dialogue with the past. Ultimately, it's impossible for us to see in an ancient Greek work of art what an ancient Greek saw. Nevertheless, to view the tradition as a whole is to help us understand its parts. And in that light, the art of our own times may appear to be the disintegration of a tradition, its dissolution. Against that, though, Western art is clearly still alive and changeable. In its past, it contains a reservoir of riches for future generations to make of what they will. And its greatest characteristic has always been its capacity for innovation and change, to draw on the achievements of other cultures, whether of ancient Egypt or of modern Africa, the Pacific, or Latin America. And so perhaps now, as our culture grows more and more global, the next phase of Western art will see it reaching back to its great humane values, to its meditations on the human condition, and integrating them with the global culture of the 21st century.